Hello, and welcome to the Faith Science Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 7th Sunday after the Epiphany for the week of February 23rd, 2025, and excited to have you here. I'm excited to begin this week's podcast, and I'm excited that we are at this in particular week, honestly. Looking through the text this week, I think there's a lot of interesting things to kind of be digging into, and especially last week where we came off of talking a little bit more about the evolution and how mammals came to be. And this kind of helping to inform us and being able to acknowledge our existence and how Jesus was potentially kind of forewarning us and kind of helping us understand that there is this constant evolution, this constant, just when you think you have something figured out, there's a setback. And this then forces you to keep growing, forces you to keep moving forward, forces you to acknowledge that you are not in control, that God is in control. And I think this is what is sometimes really difficult for us as humans, but I think also a very key point, and especially when we're getting into the early parts of Jesus' ministry, we need to be able to understand this concept if we are going to fully be able to understand what Jesus is really talking about. But then let's look back to last week's question, which was, where can history help inform our growth? And I think this is a major thing. And this was one of the things that was kind of echoed in the comments when we're looking at history, especially within the church, but I think within our own lives even. We have to acknowledge that we have to keep growing. And in order for that to happen, we have to recognize what has happened in the past, make condolences with it, not necessarily regret it, but also realize that there are times that we make mistakes that we wish we would have done differently. But being able to learn from that, to grow from that, and being able to listen and understand the stories of other people and being able to inform that. Heck, is that not what we're doing within our own scriptures? We're looking to what Jesus did and we're trying to mimic and understand what Jesus is doing and being able to apply that to our own lives today. If we are not willing to do that, we are not walking out this faith correctly. And so thus, we need to be able to walk out this faith by learning from the past and being able to then move forward through doing that, learning from it and making decisions and understanding there are things that were successful at different periods of time and recognizing that there still needs to be space for something new to come in. Because remember, when Christ came, our expectations of what Christ was going to do and what Christ was going to look like was much different than what Christ actually did. And so thus we have to give room for that. And thus we have to be able to do that ourselves. So let's just jump into it this week. The Old Testament text is out of Genesis chapter 45, verses 3 to 11 and verse 15. We have to acknowledge what has all happened here. This is the story of Joseph, who gets this multicolored coat, who is his favorite of the father and is of the second youngest because it's from Rachel, the one he was wanting to marry, not Leah, who had given him 10 kids prior. Rachel gives him 2, gives him Joseph and Benjamin, but Joseph is his favorite. The brothers don't like this. They don't like the favoritism that we see here. So Joseph gets sold off and has a crazy story to be able to get to this point. But Joseph gets to the point where he is basically like second in command in Egypt. And he has predicted through a dream that there is going to be 7 years of great harvest, which has just happened, and then followed by 7 years of famine. And this is where we're picking up. We're in year 2 of this famine, and Joseph's brothers show up. And after kind of doing some different tests and asking about his father in particular, this is where Joseph is revealing himself to his brothers and letting him know that I am not mad at you any longer. I am not going to hold this against you. This is stuff that the Lord has done and told me about. And what has actually happened is that God was able to preserve us and preserve the remnant of his people by sending me out in front of you. What was looked to be death has actually brought life. What has looked to be something that was going to destroy us has actually provided a way for us to survive. And so thus, go and get your father, and I will have ways to be able to help make sure that we are able to survive this. And he weeps and spends times with his brothers after talking to them about this. This is one of these moments that this is the finishing of this arc of Joseph, this recognition that God is seeing things that we can't see. He's seeing the life arc all the way through when we can't see it. And so thus, this is one of those moments where God has done things to prepare for this moment, to prepare for the famine. I'm going to have this happen. It's going to look terrible, but I'm placing Joseph in the position that Joseph needs to be, even though Joseph doesn't understand it until right at this moment in chapter 45. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 37, verses 1 to 11 and 39 through 40. This plays into that similar theme, recognizing how there are going to be times that things look like they're going all wrong, that evil is winning, but recognize that God is in control of all of this, that God's light will continue to shine. When you think that things are over, that God is there and waiting, going to go in and do something that you weren't expecting. This is that moment where we need to patiently wait for God and do not fret about what is going on. Recognize that this isn't necessarily always something for us to get angry about. This is something we talk to God about, and recognize that in that we will be able to be brought into the refuge of God, who rescues us from all these wicked things that happen, all these things that can tear us down, that God has seen through it already. And that's part of the hope that we have. That's part of the amazing recognition of what has happened, that yes, the abundance of what God has given us, God does want to share with us if we're willing to walk with God. The epistle text or second reading is from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 35 to 38 and 42 through 50. This continues this barrage that Paul has been having on the people of Corinth, and the recognition on how, again, picking up from last week, that this was a full body restoration in this resurrection, that it was both the physical and the spiritual coming together. But what we start getting here is what differentiates this is the physical body will pass away and return to dust, because that is what it is made of. It is made of the physical properties of this earth. The spirit that is within inside of you will also return to where it's from, and that is not from this earth. And so thus it does not pass away. It is brought back to where it belongs. And so this belief and acknowledgement of who God is part of us living that out, and also recognizing that when Christ died, it was a death of the physical body, not the death of who Christ actually is. The Spirit of God, which has been this creator who has been here from the beginning of time and will be here throughout time. He is both the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, that does not pass away. The gospel text this week is out of Luke chapter 6, verses 27 to 38. This is one of these familiar texts in certain ways where we hear more of the judgment side of Jesus here, but starting with love your enemies and do good to those who hurt you. Do not curse, but pray for those who mistreat you. Turning the other cheek if you're struck across. Being able to give from your excess, giving your coat to those who don't have. Recognizing that this is the love that God is looking for, the mercy that we are looking for. We are not here to condemn. We are here to love. We are here to share this love that God has given us, that thus we should be giving to others, recognizing the payment of what that actually is. That this is something that in doing this, we don't hate, we love. We give, we care. These acknowledgments are huge, and recognizing that this is a gospel of pure reformation within us. this total change within us, recognizing that what this actually means is very drastic. And it means that we have to really embody the image of what does love look like and not taking credit for it, acknowledging that God is the one that we give the credit to. So before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do our shameless plugs for Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between the Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help prepare for this podcast, but also prepare for worship week after week. So if you haven't checked that resource out, there's great commentaries there, great discussion going on over there, just a vast amount of resources over there. So I'd highly recommend checking out workingpreacher.org. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Vanderbilt's Divinity Library for their Revised Common Lectionary, because not only do they lay out the text beautifully every week, but they also have art, prayers, hymns, liturgical colors, daily devotions. Remember, the reason that we're looking into this is we are preparing for worship, whether you are in front of the pews or in the pews. This is something that helps us get ready. And in doing that, this is part of that training. So make sure that you're stopping over to the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, because I'd highly recommend checking out that resource. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection covering a wide variety of ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies to look at with your weekly preaching, much like this, or you can get the monthly newsletter, which covers some more broader things that are going on and taking more of an ecological approach. If you enjoy listening to this podcast for a half an hour each week, I know you're going to enjoy the resources plugged over there at Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. So I'd highly recommend checking out the first link down in the show notes and taking a peek at those. What does it mean for us to acknowledge our enemies? Why would we do that? Why would we allow things that deep down within our humanness that we are scared of, that we are fearful for? Why would we allow that to happen? Why would we allow this to happen and for us to grow out of that? How does that happen? I think there is an aspect of it that humbles us for sure. And I think as we talk about the subject and where I'm going to go this week, I think there's a couple things that can be helpful with this for us. Now, before I jump into this, I know that within the last month we have had the California fires. And I'm not bringing this subject up as something that I know can be a little bit triggering for that. So I'm giving a forewarning that I will be talking about the use of fire and why it is important within ecosystems. But I think it's also, I want to acknowledge that I know that this is a sore subject, especially within our country right now, because of how recent we have gone through this. And I think we understand and acknowledge the destruction that can come out of that. But I think there's also an other side of this that we need to talk about a little bit as well, because I have a feeling that this is something that we're going to be continuing to deal with, not necessarily always in California, but around the world. And I think it's something that we need to figure out how to balance. So let's talk about this. What is the purpose of fire within an ecosystem? Why is it so important? Fire, the big thing with fire is it is the great equalizer. Sure, there are things that can survive fire. There's certain tree species that have abilities, and depending on the severity of the fire, can survive. But there's also an aspect, depending on how severe the fire is, that it can be the great equalizer and level everything, making it impossible, basically, for anything to survive. But it's essential for a lot of these ecosystems. So what is fire doing? What fire does is not only is it killing a lot of the different vegetation, but it's helping to return nutrients and bring carbon back to the soil. So what does this mean? The nitrogen is also being brought back to the soil, which is essential for many plants to be able to grow. And in doing that, because you've taken out a lot of the different competition, now there is actually a great opportunity for plants to grow. Take the jack pine, which in the western United States is quite prevalent. It is dependent on fire for it to be able to grow. Not for the parent tree, but for its future offspring. The seeds only open with heat and fire. knowing that at that point, the opportunity has expanded to allow for the opportunity for those trees to grow and grow abundantly and grow well. There's nutrients in the soil. There's things that are able to be there, and there's less competition. It is a great adaptation that has developed. Prairies. One of the things that you notice after a burn is the abundance of actual species increases tremendously because you have leveled the playing field. You've brought some of these back down to the bottom, and it's not necessarily who can grow the tallest, who can have the deepest root system. It allows for some of these different plant species that are more early prairie species to come in. I distinctly remember in my college days doing samples of looking at different plots that they had done prescribed burns on and looking at taking a 1 meter by 1 meter square and dropping it down and looking at how many different plant species there were. And the older the prairie got, the less species there actually was. It was quite common. This is essential. But we as humans really like to control things. Heck, we like doing it with how we look at our faith as well. We like feeling that sense of control, and thus, since fire can be so damaging, we like to control it. But with that, it has also caused a lot of pain. Take wildfires out in Yellowstone multiple times. We'll try going more of a environmental slant here instead of hitting straight to LA. That fire in the 80s that still is talked about was much, much bigger in the early 90s, much, much bigger than it ever should have been. And why? Because we had done fire prevention. We were trying to prevent the fires from ever happening and figuring that this was the best way of being able to help preserve Yellowstone. Well, what was it actually doing? There was a lot of debris and things that were needing to be burned, needing to help the ecosystem actually turn over. And thus, what did you do? You actually created more and more and more fuel, making it an actually much bigger fire than it ever would have otherwise been, because you would have had smaller fires. And they eventually would have gone out when they ran out of fuel. But when you keep stacking that fuel for decades, because we were preventing fire from happening, it becomes all the harder to actually be able to control. And thus, when the fires have happened, it has actually helped to turn over the ecosystem to allow it to actually thrive. It may look bad initially, but it's allowing it to be more sustainable long term. This isn't that much different than when we think about carrying capacity with animals. And we've talked about this in the past. One of the things that we have to wrestle with is, yes, they're endangered species for a reason. But there is also a point at some point that we have to allow nature to do its own thing. And if we protect a species too much, you're actually putting the whole ecosystem into a weird flux where there isn't balance. And when it doesn't have balance, you're just hurting yourself long term. Sure, you may be able to eke out a few more great years, but what does it mean in the long run? What does it mean if they get beyond the carrying capacity of the ecosystem? I'll attach a link down below. I was just listening to a short video from a snow crab farmer and talking about how in the early 2009, 2010, there was a boom year for snow crabs and that there was huge populations and they had a huge amount of young. And how in the last few years now, they've had just these really, really hard times. And what's happened is a compounding effect of a couple different things, of one being the aspect that you had all these young teenage snow crabs, and thus they were eating more, but also the compounding factor that the ocean water that year in particular was warmer, which then meant when the water warms, they've also noticed that snow crabs eat more. And so it made it so it was harder for the whole population and eventually actually causing a huge crash for multiple reasons. Because of the stress, because it allowed some other fish to come in and eat them, cod that weren't normally there, because there was so many and there wasn't food, it caused death. And thus now it has to do a major recovery. Just because it had a boom and there wasn't necessarily the natural thing to help curve it off. Now, granted, there's some additional factors there that have also contributed and some things that we aren't fully understanding. I'll attach a video down below. But this is something very common. We have looked at with multiple different prey speciation across the world. If you let it go rampant, at some point, it literally hits the capacity and ends up crashing the whole species because there just isn't enough there. You have to have balance. The idea that you can just keep squeezing something out isn't necessarily good. When we look at these texts this week, it's almost as if it is being stated, recognize that God is in control, not you. And recognize that there is a balance that God is trying to walk and that God has understood. Please allow that balance to happen. What you might see as hard and difficult and as challenging and as evil maybe isn't necessarily that way. Or maybe it is, but God is already ahead of it. The crucifixion was meant to be the end of all of this. It was only the beginning. Selling Joseph into slavery was the end of him for his brother, and yet he ends up helping them survive. Jesus then stating, love your enemies, loving the people that you have a hard time with, loving the aspect of, yes, there are times that an ecosystem has to turn over and it may cause some very difficult pain in the short term, but it's for the long-term benefit. And that's very hard. We as humans like holding on to things and keeping things the way that we understand them and the way we know them. It gives us a sense of control and feeling of, oh, I know what's going on. But again, going back to last week and this week, that's not how this works. What God is truly calling us into is to love and to care. And part of love is being able to love something and being able to recognize at some point it does need to change. It does need to evolve. It does need to go through hardships. And that's hard in the time. But if we don't ever allow that to happen, it ends up hurting things actually worse later. Thinking about a prairie ecosystem, if you never burn it, there's only a couple species there. And what does that actually do? You're losing the diversity of the prairie. And the beauty of the prairie is the vast amount of insects and the vast amount of things that are going on and the way that it can provide in so many different ways for so many different creatures. If you get it to where it's only a few species, it can't provide the same way. It just can't. If you prevent burning from ever happening in the ecosystem, you just having trees get older and older and older. The undergrowth just grows bigger and bigger and bigger, and it becomes something that isn't actually healthy. There's a few species that have gone really well, but at some point they don't even do well because there isn't something that is inspiring the change to allow us to grow, allowing things to actually work together, allowing the understanding of how all these ecosystems are dependent and work together to happen. In order for us to grow, there is an understanding and a dependence on that we are going to need each other. In faith and in life, we're going to have that happen. But I'd also argue it's us recognizing that we don't control all of this as well. I know that right now, the place that I live, I am a tenant of a couple acres of land, which I have been blessed with where I'm at. But then what am I going to do with that? The decisions and things that I'm going to make need to also consider what's going to be best for not only for me and future humans here, but what is best for the land and the other things that are there. One of the big things that I've noticed this winter is there's a small little ravine in our land, and it is a major spot for the deer to get out of the wind all winter long. I need to be conscientious of what's going to happen to them if I disturb these areas for them, where they literally run and play and bed and take care of themselves. There is an aspect of me also being a steward to them, because this is a gift that God gave not only me, but also to them. God created them. God created the aspect that fire is needed to turn over an ecosystem, to allow for nutrients to be returned back to the earth, to allow for new things to grow. And so if we never allow something to ever burn, we're actually preventing growth from happening. We're actually hurting the recycling feature that the environment naturally has. And how healthy does that sound if we are preventing the earth from doing its own natural recycling process? We've seen the effects. We've seen these major fires. We see where that actually hurts in multiple different ways. There are certain species that look for certain cycles of where these things are. And if they don't ever hit the reset button, it makes it hard for an early species to ever come back. I think about where I grew up, there was always the black spruce and tamaracks and how they interacted. And you could age a bog based off of, is there more black spruce or there more tamaracks? As they grow, they will literally push the one aside. But if you never have that turnover, how is it ever going to have where you get that balance back the other way? We need these ecosystems to be able to turn around and turn over and allow for new growth to happen. Are we allowing ourselves to have the same types of things in our lives? So the question I have for you this week is, where are we allowing things to be turned over? Where are we allowing things to be turned over? Because turned over means a lot of different things in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's a restart. Sometimes it's going backwards, but it's also allowing for new things to start, allowing for new ideas to happen. New nutrients are back in the ground, ready to rumble, allowing for new things to grow. And like we talked about last week, we can't just always go back. We have to be able to continue to move forward. An ecosystem can't go back and change things after a fire to pre-fire. It's never going to be exactly the same. And it's going to take a lot of time to get back to where it was similar to where it was before. And that's both a blessing and a curse. Yes, there's the mourning process that we go through. And yes, it's hard sometimes for us to look at, but recognize that there's new things and new ways, and the environment will heal. And it's going to allow for new and different things to happen that we maybe didn't expect, and look for that beauty there. I know that some of this stuff is really hard to hear in response to what happened over the last month and a half with the LA fires. LA is going to be different. And there's a lot of pain and hardship because there's a lot of personal stuff within that were lost within those fires. But I think one of the things too is LA can come back better in a different way. You can think about some different ways and maybe helping to do some what's going to be helpful to help prevent stuff like this from happening in the future. Is there things that we can do? Can we provide that? People mixing together and working together and building communities back. Maybe reevaluating things, because in certain ways you're back down to the dirt again. What can grow? What can be new? And it's easy for me to speak as I'm half a country away. I don't have the pain and the connection that others have. And I know that there's a lot of pain that is there. But I think there's also an aspect of us as outsiders who aren't in LA, allowing the people of LA to tell us what they need and to give them the space to be able to create, to see what grows. LA might be different than it was before, but I'm also excited to see what that means. Yellowstone after the fires was different than it was before, but in certain ways it's beautiful because of what it has gone through now. And we understand and appreciate what happened there. When prairies burn, the amount of beautiful flowers that come in the next year is amazing because it has allowed for new speciation to come in. When we allow animals to hit carrying capacities and having this balance of ebb and flows as they're working together in unison, recognizing that the effects of one affects the others and it swings back and forth and the pendulum of the ecosystem works together. There's a beauty there that allows us to be able to see how wonderfully and beautifully made the creation is. And being able to acknowledge that and understand that allows us to actually understand in a small way how we fit into that. That there's ebbs and flows within life, things that are important at certain stages and things that at different stages need to get re-picked up. There's times where things are perfect for that moment and times where it needs to be set aside for a while. And I think these are the types of things that we need to be thinking about and considering. Because when we do that, it allows us to actually grow. It allows new and beautiful things to come from the ashes of what was before. And allow for what would appear to be destruction to actually be the life-giving nutrients to the new beginning of the next phase that allows us to grow all the more in our relationship with God. What was meant for destruction provided life instead. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.